To the curious, the seekers, and to the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych podcast. Today, we are examining an unusual corporation that you may never have heard of, called New Knowledge. You may never have heard of New Knowledge, but if you've heard of Russiagate or many of the other political brouhahas that have been going on in our country the last few years, you may have been affected by New Knowledge and their work. To discuss that topic today, I'm Cindy. Hello, I'm an INFJ Enneagram 2 Wing 1, and with me are Ken, our MBTI specialist. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Cindy. I'm an INTJ, and I believe my Enneagram is 9.
Okay. And also with me is Don, our Enneagram specialist. Hello, Don.
Hello, Cindy and Ken. And I am INTJ in the Myers-Briggs MBTI and Enneagram type 5 social subtype.
So I think the three of us are going to need to apply all of our intelligence and all of our intuition today as we discuss this topic. And Ken, I think that you are going to lead us off.
Sure. I favored the spy versus spy icon. Not only are we talking about New Knowledge, but we're also talking about their counterpart in Russia, and it was identified as the Internet Research Agency, and it later changed name to GlavSet. And we just want to say at the outset that there was meddling in the election. I believe it was somewhat ineffectual, but there is some evidence, and we'll take a peek at it in a second. And the Russians had been very interested in influencing the political attitudes and affections of the people on their border. So they were very active on their internet portals in Belarus and some of the fringe outlying areas. And they were basically doing what our side was doing also, is fighting against populism on their border. Yet on the inside, trying to solidify, it's probably the impulse of Russian intelligence is to solidify the internal political dialogue and squelch any outside influences on their side. So we have kind of this balance between these two, and really the subtext here is the IRA, or the Internet Research Agency, versus New Knowledge, who I do believe has a monopoly. There was somehow arranged that they would be the sole arbiter and distributor of a lot of the Russia, what we call the Russiagate news item study that we'll show later. But they had a tremendous amount of influence on all the mainstream media outlets that we're familiar with. Let's take a look, though, if we could, Cindy, at the Wikipedia page, and we'll take a peek at the actual evidence of the Russian influence on the American electorate. And, we'll try to get a handle on how significant that was. And Don, what was your impression of this evidence? I don't know if I hadn't seen it until recently. I always kind of dismissed it, but I guess there is some amount of credibility to this. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, there always is. And this is nothing new. And nations have interfered with other nations forever. And the United States is famous for interfering with other nations, and other nations do it to us on a much smaller scale, usually. I think what's different this time, of course, is that the media has a campaign to supposedly expose this so-called meddling, of course, with the United States posing as the victim, with the Democrat Party in particular posing as the victim. So I think that's the real new element here.
And it was traced to a building. Well, we'll take a quick look at some of the events. I guess they had the one that I see more often than not is the Black Matters US, which is purported to be a IRA website And the thing about cyber evidence is you never really know, but we can. It seems plausible that the Russians were doing something. So I tend to think this probably was, is fairly accurate.
Now, one of the things to point out here right off the bat is that because for people that aren't very technologically literate, I'll just briefly describe how IP addresses work and how IP masking works. And that's essential to what the discussion when we're talking about attacks originating from certain areas. So typically, IP addresses within any given country will have IP addresses within certain ranges. And then therefore, you would be able to say this IP address or this attack or this information came from this country or within this country because it had this IP address range. Well, that's like kindergarten in the IT world. And if you are a spy agency, the very, very, very first thing you do if you are going to be doing any kind of an information attack from a location within your country is you're going to mask your IP address. You are going to make it appear as if you are coming from someplace else. That is, in the spy world, that's like first grade at the highest. So this is really simple stuff, but people that aren't used to living in that world don't know it. And unfortunately, the media is not about to teach it to us. So it's important for us to make that point that if a spy wanted to hack into another country, they would make it appear that they were coming from someplace other than where they actually are.
Right. So I guess that introduces sort of a relativistic approach to evidence, but I think for purposes here, we'll just accept that these events did occur. And but what I'm looking for two things really: is what effect did they really have? It's the psychology of how to influence conservatives on the conservative end. We're very cynical. I'm sort of a moderate to conservative. It depends on the issue, but there's no. I don't attach with labels. Many people don't. So we don't usually trust as readily new information, novel information that's sort of suspended without a linkage to something else. And that's why it takes me a while to trust any presenter on YouTube or whatever. And I think they underestimated that. The second thing, and I'd really like to get feedback on this from both of you, is, and I'm puzzled, why would the Russians want Donald Trump to win? First question. The second question is, if they did hack Hillary's emails, or the DNC, I think they might have done both. Why didn't they hold on to that information, wait for Hillary to be elected, and then use that as leverage? I don't understand why they wanted Trump to win, frankly.
Great questions. Yeah, I think the narrative is that Trump has ties to Russia that he was intending to use to get rich, and he and Putin were going to basically team up to betray each of their own populations. And Putin was promising Trump that he could get rich. Oh, I forgot, he's already rich. Oh, yeah. Actually, his wealth has gone down. Whoa, wait a minute. Maybe that narrative doesn't work so good. Trump's wealth has actually decreased quite a bit. So I'm not sure about that.
I just don't see the payoff for the Russians. I mean, they're embroidering the story, and it makes, it's possible. Trump builds hotels, and there's a lot of money involved. But the Russians have got to be thinking about what's in it for us, and I just don't see a payoff here with their defense budget ballooning out of control, because candidate Trump made no bones about saying that he would increase the defense budget, and that just goes without saying that the Russians would have to match that. And I don't see that being in their national interest to encourage somebody who wants to build the military to that degree.
New Cold War, huh? Why would they want a new Cold War? I'm not so sure that that they did. Yeah, I agree with you.
So it's sort of a forensic thing. It's just a lot of times mean motive opportunity. The motive is questionable, and they can tell us all these stories and all about IP addresses and all the other things. But when you get down to it, it's just common sense tells me this doesn't. It just doesn't add up. So
and when it starts not adding up, as you say, I think the obvious question is, wait a minute. Could it be that our media is lying to us? And why would they be lying to us? And okay, I've just got to throw this out there. Maybe they want a certain nation to be an enemy, and maybe it doesn't really serve that nation's interests, but maybe it serves the defense establishment within the United States. Their purpose is to have this particular enemy, namely Russia. Now, on the other hand, maybe it's a look over here, not over here scenario where there is another enemy that they don't want us to know about that may actually be doing some things that are not in the interests of the United States, although they claim to be. And I'm speaking namely about communist China there. And it's just possible that there's an agenda going on here. And I'm just saying that's the first question you got to ask when things don't seem to add up. So ask the questions.
Cindy, can we take a look at the building? I've never been impressed with the IRA's data center. And in fact, it looks to me like they do this in where I live too, is on an office building, they'll paint in the windows if they're renting space. And it's just, okay, we look at this thing and it's not a hardened structure. It's got windows all over the place. The power lines run right next to it. So you could conceivably tap using the electronic field bugging method. This is a lot of little things this is just not striking me as being a high-end, secure.
Oh, but maybe it's all below ground. Maybe the top is just a decoy. Maybe everything else is that the real thing is below ground.
Yeah, maybe. I don't see any windows down there though, but it could be.
You know what I find interesting is the fact that they chose a name that would cause their initials to be IRA.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was thinking the same thing, that immediate confusion. I think that's the result of this acronym is like, wait, Ireland? What?
Then they switched it to this other name, Glavset. That sounds a little more Russian. Who knows? But let's look at the Jimmy Dore clip. And the reason I like this clip, I find Jimmy very entertaining, and he's on the far left, but he's just somebody I can listen to. And I think this is where our political situation will go in the future as well. We'll have differences of opinion, but they'll be able to be somewhat handled in a little more sane manner than what we're seeing now. But it's encouraging to see the left starting to become more critical of their own, on their side of the spectrum, and they're more interested in the truth, and that's very encouraging. And I think they've actually done, in some cases, as good as or better than the right on at least the broadcasting end of it. I'd say on the investigative side, the new knowledge people have really underestimated their, the strength of the right. First of all, we don't fall for these strange memes that come out of nowhere. I don't know who does. Maybe their people do, but we don't. It's just kind of insulting to our intelligence to even. We'll bring the memes up later and show that. But let's run this clip of Jimmy Dore, sort of coming from the same attitude that I've got here from his political perspective. So I find this really interesting. I learn a lot from listening to these reporters.
Okay, so we've already told you about this a couple times. There was this report that dropped on December 17th. New report on Russian disinformation prepared for the Senate shows the operation scale and sweep. Now, we told you about this, right? That was the report that said Black Lives Matter was being controlled by Russians, gay people were being controlled by Russians, progressives were being controlled by Russians, everybody's being controlled by Russians, according to this new report for the Senate. Now, remember, this was the report that Chris Hayes made fun of right? Because he showed the memes that they were saying that was controlling people. But here's a little bit more from the Washington Post. A report prepared for the Senate that provides the most sweeping analysis yet of Russia's disinformation campaign around the 2016 election found the operation used every major social media platform to deliver words, images, and videos tailored to voters' interests to help elect President Trump, and worked even harder to support him while in office. Man, this is pretty explosive. We've already debunked this, by the way, a couple times already, this stupid report. But I just want to show you how they've covered this report. And of course, we've told you that you're never going to get the truth about the wars. You're never going to get the truth about what's happening with our foreign policy from the mainstream news. They're always for every war, and they're still pushing this conspiracy theory that Trump is a traitor and Russia controls our country. So off of this report, again, this Senate report, you look at the explosive language. The incendiary used every major social media platform.
I think they missed MySpace.
I bet they did. Friendster.
Oh shoot! I was trying to think of that one.
So not only that, but this is from Gray Zone. Never mind that 56% of the Troll Farms pages appeared after the election, or that 25% of them were seen by no one, or that their minuscule online presence paled in comparison to the millions of dollars spent on social media by the two major presidential campaigns and their supporters to sway votes. So they never mention that. They don't mention this in the Washington Post. They do. They used every major social media, but they don't tell you any of this other information. And plus, they don't tell you this about Google. So here is Representative Nadler, who called the Russian interference in our election. He called it like Pearl Harbor. Here he is asking the CEO of Google how much money the Russians actually spent on all their Google platforms to try to sway the election. Watch this.
Okay, thank you. Now, according to media reports, Google found evidence that Russian agents spent thousands of dollars to purchase ads on its advertising platforms that span multiple Google products as part of the Russian agents' campaign to interfere in the election 2 years ago. Additionally, Juniper Downs, head of global policy for YouTube, testified in July that YouTube had identified and shut down multiple channels containing thousands of videos associated with the Russian misinformation campaign.
Thousands.
Does Google now know the full extent to which its online platforms were exploited by Russian actors in the election 2 years ago?
Here it comes.
We have we undertook a very thorough investigation.
In
2016, we now know that there were two main ad accounts linked to Russia, which advertised on Google for about $4,700 in advertising. We also found other limited.
Wait, total of $4,700?
That's right.
Total of $4,700. So we're just recapping this because we've showed you this before in other reports. But
yeah, we were sitting here going, had my pinky out when I went thousands of dollars. It's like, oh my gosh, these people are truly evil. Thousands. I bet they got thousands of clicks too.
The thing about the big lie is that you don't need to sway an election. You've just got to sway a tiny fraction. And this is, I think, they kind of, in political influencing, know this, and I don't know how many people actually sat down and watched this clip or even saw the Google guy. I still have a lot of people that believe the Russia influence story, and it's just not that significant. I don't think it had any significant effect on on our election. It's Central Europe. I don't know. Let's move on to the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is more of an EU animal. And it did spawn I believe the career of Renee DiResta, very, very talented, great presenter, somewhat partisan, of course. And her career, I believe, started there. And then she later became one of the big three at New Knowledge. And this is an interesting story. We put it on our Twitter page, Poli-Psych Podcast on Twitter. Cindy will put a link to it in the show notes for today, but we scroll down a little bit if we could, Cindy, and we can see the German Marshall Fund. That's what it's called. And then this is they're basically establishing the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is still active. And I'm not sure what Renee's role was there, but it was pretty high up. Now, the Hamilton 68 originated around that time. We'll do a show on that at some point in the future. It's a list of suspected Russian accounts. And the scary part about this is that even if you're not aware of it, this is how they word it. They say that you can be willing or an unwilling purveyor of Russian propaganda, and you will still end up on this list. So it's kind of a template for just making everyone guilty. If you don't agree with them, you can just accuse them of whatever you can fabricate online.
Yeah, exactly. I have to point out, since you're moving on, there was a point where I noticed that exact thing in the Jimmy Dore clip when he was naming, all of these associations with Russia, and they did this and they did that, and I could not help but think of the Red Scare and thinking of what's the, not McCloskey, what the
McCarthy. Yeah.
McCarthy. Yeah, the whole McCarthy Red Scare thing in the 50s. And this is exactly the same tactic. It's like, oh my gosh, they're doing this, they're doing this, they're doing this. And then, everybody in Hollywood was a communist. And you know what? There was some truth there, but it got blown way out of proportion.
Well, I think it's a social manipulative, and it's how it works. Let's take RT as a very good example. And they've really been bearing down on RT. And the case that they are, stitched to the hip with Putin is not that far-fetched, even though they do appear to be independent journalists. And we might be able to dismiss just because there's a picture of Putin in the studio in Moscow that these people in New York with their own, I think Max Kaiser and some of these people. Now, personally, I don't retweet. I don't even really go to RT. I may glance at the headlines, but you know what? Sometimes you just have to take your hat off to these people. They've managed to tar and feather RT. They did the same thing with Donald Trump with the Access Hollywood tape. It's just the way it goes. So many times, even if it's not true, they'll go ahead with it anyway because they know that they can link that into the subconscious intuitive of the population, that it will restrain behavior, and it did restrain my behavior. I
agree with you. I had the same reaction in the early, what we will call the pre-Trump awakening era. I looked at RT stories fairly often, but as soon as this whole thing having to do with Russian meddling began to be brought up, I said, I can see that coming a mile away. I'm staying away from RT because I don't want to be linked to this. Even though I knew it was bogus, I just avoided it for appearance's sake.
Yeah, it's the chilling effect, and I think that might be a legal term. If your policies have a chilling effect on media, that can also be interpreted as a First Amendment violation, I believe, but I'd have to confirm that at some point. So it does work, and this is sort of the terraforming of social sensibility, and it's manufacturing consent, you could call it. And we'll move on to new knowledge now, and these are some heavyweights. We have three people, and we'll go to the names list here just so we get that right. And they're have very interesting backgrounds. We've got Jonathan Morgan. He's the one you'll see more often on up front in publishing and so on. High-end stuff, State Department, computational propaganda researcher, DARPA, Brookings Institution. He was in and out of the White House and was familiar to President Obama. And so this is a very talented rising star in the intelligence community. Ryan Fox, I think he did his service in the Middle East theater, and sort of the introvert of the crowd. Jonathan is more of an extrovert. Renee, another extrovert, great presenter. They're just, they're on their end of the political spectrum, and they're pulling out all the stops. They learned all the tricks of the trade. I've seen some other reports on the backgrounds, and we're talking about military grade linguistics and the stuff that you normally don't see used on a civilian population by people that served in the U.S. military, coming back and then basically in training or applying their skills. Basically, we're paying for this too, because we finance the military industrial complex, and so at that point it gets a little bit dicey. But these, I don't think anything they're doing is illegal. It's just we have to, as good journalists, take apart their game a little bit.
Yeah, and I've got to point out, because you're giving us some great detail, but real high level, new knowledge. Hey, that's a good thing. We like new knowledge. Okay, well, how could these be the bad guys? New knowledge is good, right? Well,
they're selling. They actually are selling their services. They're probably going to get away from the Russia stuff. We'll look at the headline screen is pretty horrific. Let's put that up there for a second. We'll linger on this, and I don't think it'll be up for much longer. This is actually a collection of clips from the website, and it displays of all the headlines that were pertinent mostly to the Russia issue. And there it is. And we're going to leave that up for a little while and just pause on that. And Don, look this over. I don't know if you've seen this before. And you can see where these articles ended up. Some of them were where authorship was claimed by one of the New Knowledge people, and then also claimed by the New York Times. There were several cases that we put on our Twitter of essentially dual authorship, not plagiarism, because I'm sure it was agreed to. But this is our fake news.
Yeah, I noticed this, and I got the point that you were, or that this picture presents, which is, it looks like this is a coordinated approach. And we've all heard about 4 a.m. talking points, and I think we've actually perhaps found out where some of those, the actual source of some of those 4 a.m. talking points, they perhaps come from one place.
They would almost have to. I think the Russians may be doing the same thing with this IRA cutout that they have. Otherwise, what happens if they work at cross purposes? They obviously have selected the most qualified people they possibly could. All three of them are really well qualified for this work, and I've looked at their computational linguistic program a little bit, and it's very advanced. And in fact, it's so advanced that I don't think the tech companies that are starting to contract with them understand the nature of the black box that they're buying.
Yeah, and when you say they're very qualified, I'm sure you don't mean qualified journalistically. I think you mean qualified linguistically to create a certain picture using.
Oh, totally. No, it's
words.
programmers.
Yeah.
In fact, they even say that, it almost dismissively, like, they'll say something like, well, it's too complicated we don't want to bore you with the details, and then they kind of zip right on to the next point. So
red flag.
Well, the problem I have with it is that it leaves open, especially if they're partisan and they've never displayed. There's only one case, and it was Ryan Fox did have an article on Trump's hotels getting tarred and feathered over the shithole countries controversy. So basically, they were posting fake reviews of the on all the Trump hotels. So he threw him a bone there. It would be nice to see a little more objectivity out of these people, because again, they are they're military grade, and they should be serving everybody with whatever. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with stopping if the Russians are coming in and doing anything. This is our country too. So this is the one problem I have with these people, is that they're assuming that we don't care as much about our country as they do. We do, and we want them to do their job. And if there is something, if there really is a threat, we want it to be dealt with. But here, I don't see that. I'm starting to see this whole thing unravel.
These people are hired guns. It doesn't matter that much who hires them. They're hired guns. And in 2016, Obama made it legal for the government, the U.S. government, to propagandize its own people, and that's what we're seeing here.
In the upper right corner, we've got the Fact Company September 28th during the Kavanaugh hearing, and we can kind of laugh at the headline. It's kind of funny, really, but it's, in a way, it's not funny. It's we've got the justice, we've got three branches of government, and on this page, we've got basically influence in all three branches of government. And it's just, I think it's inappropriate to blame these unknown Hamilton 68 accounts. I think is probably where they were going. We don't know who they are. We don't know how they arrived at that conclusion. We don't know if they're Russian bots, actors, or if they're just people they don't want to have a voice.
Well, I don't know if you've mentioned this already, Ken, but it almost begs the question, do they have a relationship with these so-called Russian propagandists who may not even be Russian propagandists? It's almost like, create the story and then profit from it.
Mm-hmm. It's possible. And that's the main thing, is to consider the possibilities. We're being entrained to reach a conclusion. Actually, these people are not interested in us. They're interested in entraining their side of the political spectrum. And it's worked very, very well. And the amount of information here, these are millions and millions of minds that were affected by this campaign, and this is just a tiny fraction of what's on the site, or what was pushed out to the public. And if you focus on some of the BBC, CNBC, New York Times appears quite a bit, CBS, and Wired. And some of the side magazines are Politico. It's got fairly high coverage as well. So repeating these stories over and over again, and they'll end up in also the small town newspapers. When I did a search on some of these headlines, I would come back with 20 hits carrying the exact same headline. And these guys are ghostwriting. They basically made up this Russian narrative and amplified it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's a tendency in the human psyche to figure that if you're in a small town, you're going to assume that those in the big towns, the big cities, are playing in the big leagues, and you're just in podunk, and what do you know? So you're going to take your cue from the big leagues guys, and that's how these guys operate. And I think that's probably how they were able to get as big a reach as they did, was because we've got people following other people that think that they're independent thinkers when they're not. And what the headline that jumps out at me is, kind of playing on this whole idea of these guys are just posers, is the 7-step program for fighting disinformation. Boy, that's good stuff.
Look at number 7. I actually know that. I don't have it up here. It's probably on the website, but the whole point of, I forget what it was, but the number 7 is sort of like, now it's time to censor, whatever. I don't even know if most people get to number 7, but that's the point, is that they're selling this could be a Trojan horse strategy, maybe not, but it could be that they know so much about this algorithm, and they'll sell it as, you need to have this. They do use fear quite a bit. There are a bunch of other headlines that are outward reaching sales hyping articles that don't concern Russia, that just concern the internet. And that's where they're moving. I think I don't expect to see these articles on their site for much longer.
What really struck me about that headline was that if you're going to protect people, what are you going to do? You're going to pose as the person. If you're going to prey on people, you pose as the person that's going to protect them. So we have these new knowledge guys that are very adept at steering thought where they want it to go. And what do? They pose as the protectors. Oh, there's people that are trying to steal your thoughts and you're going to steer it wherever they want it to go. Oh, be careful of those people. Oh, can't be us because we're protecting you from them. I mean, it becomes so obvious once you get their mindset, but it's incredibly devious.
Well, yeah, neurolinguistic hypnosis, the subject does want the desired outcome, and the same thing happens on the right. You know, we have to be honest. And if somebody comes along with let's say you're virulently anti-Clinton, and they've got a halfway plausible story about the Clintons, then we're just so the saw cuts both ways. But
yeah, there are trolls in both camps, no doubt about it.
But this is This is much more organized, and that's the kind of the scary part about it. But
and it's not low level a dummy doing this. That's it's very sophisticated.
Oh, this is the cream of the crop. Yeah, I mean, actually, Jonathan sort of reminds me of Nixon when he was. Not that I remember that, but Nixon came to the public's attention during the McCarthy hearings at about the same age. A young upstart,
interesting,
smart, somewhat similar in outward persona. I will say,
I could see that. Yeah,
just a quick one on the MBTI. We there is a little bit of an MBTI thing here. So I noticed this with Jonathan Morgan and also Renee. They're both very extroverted, and they move so quickly that you don't have time for the introverted functions to really take hold when you're listening to them. And we'll play some clips of Jonathan. Yep. And what that means is most of the population would type out as the sensing feeling, SF, I think is the largest portion of the population. And so one of those functions will be extroverted. So when they're working at that speed, at that blinding speed, they're going to nail down one of those two functions in their audience, and they actually. Maybe they just sort of are doing it intuitively, but then they're planting the intuitive linkages so cleverly by moving so fast, and sometimes it comes in the form of a joke, or it comes in the form of a photo. But let's, Don, take it away a little bit, and we'll move into the Jonathan.
Well, yeah, I definitely want to react to what you just said. There is that when I saw clips of Jonathan Morgan, and okay, we haven't shown it to our audience here yet, but I'll tell you what I saw. I saw a guy that reminded me a lot of Jim Carrey, and he's known for his quick wit, also his very physical manner, but the speed at which his mind moved and the nature, the way that he could pinpoint an emotional idea, but but he would trigger it with his mind. It's very indicative of a 7 Enneagram type, and which Jim Carrey is. And I'm just using that as an example. Robin Williams is another good example in the public eye of a 7. Very, very quick mentally. Once at an Enneagram meeting, I was talking to a 7 and somebody who was a self-identified Enneagram 7. And he said that he went through a period in his life in which he was very concerned that he himself might be a sociopath, because he found it very easy to trigger people in the way that he wanted to trigger them. He would be able to think circles around them and lead their emotions whatever way he wanted them to go. And he knew he had that ability. And that is something that a 7 can relate to. And I'm not saying 7s are sociopaths, but there is that tendency. Other unhealthy types have their own way of doing sociopathy. It's not unique to 7s, but this rapid fire wit and linkage to the feelings, to the emotions of people is very definitely a 7 entertainer style, and it's pretty recognizable, I believe. And as a 5, as an Enneagram 5, I go to 7 when I'm under stress, so I'm familiar with what it feels like, not necessarily in an aggressive way, because for me it's when I'm stressed. I'm kind of on the defensive when I do it, but I can imagine how somebody that's used to living there could use that as a powerful offensive weapon. So very interesting stuff from my perspective.
Yeah, he's got what was Nixon's Enneagram?
Well, he would be a 6, and almost everybody that in the Enneagram world that I know of thinks as Nixon as a 6. And of course, paranoia is a famous characteristic of 6s, and Nixon is known for his paranoia. But as a wing, then he would have a 7 wing. So he would be right on that edge of being able to go into that. And Nixon is known for being very intelligent. He would be able to go into the 7 wing aspect of his personality. So I think there's a relationship there. Yeah.
Well, I think what you're seeing is kind of a pattern. The social media companies, I think, are operating very large platforms. It's very complicated to implement solutions at anything of that size. And so what we've seen when ISIS was manipulating social media to amplify their message as terrorists, when Russia was using social media to manipulate the public conversation in the 2016 elections, and now when anybody with an axe to grind about anything decides that they can also manipulate social media to further their agenda, the social media companies come back at that and say, okay, let's focus on a really narrow solution. So let's make sure that ISIS can't post on our platform, or let's make sure that Russia can't post political advertising or can't pay for political advertising on our platform. And those things are really good at, you know, kind of solving a narrow problem and coming up with an immediate solution to whatever the current crisis is, but it doesn't solve the systemic problem. It doesn't solve the kind of inherent design problems on these platforms that allow for this type of exploitation to take place, that allow for bad actors to find the kinks in the system, to game the mechanics of how these platforms are designed, and amplify their message.
Okay, that really got me when I was listening to it. Amplify the message, and Cindy and I were talking offline about this. Is media is about amplification, and we're watching it right now. We use microphones, and we're actually doing it right now. And the whole human impulse of communication is to be heard and to form an idea that can be understood, and to make a contribution to culture in a way that you know, advances our calling, or whatever you want to call it. That's part of being human. So he slipped that in there, and it's so clever because he's got this run up to it. But what he's actually doing is he's denying the voice to whoever he self-defines as pejorative in that context.
Yeah, and he's doing it in a like you said, a very clever way that he gives you small examples that make sense, and he's saying, okay, now that you agree with me that this is a good thing, let's tackle the big issue. And of course, he doesn't name it, but what he's the only possible intention there is a large-scale censorship, and he doesn't name it, but that's exactly what he's talking about.
Yeah, and I think what they'll look at this system, and I've done some studying just on how the system works, and basically they're using a quantitative sociological analysis using linguistics or words, and the English language is constantly evolving anyway. So you can actually influence that evolution. The next time someone has any doubt and they're on the liberal side, just look them in the eye and just say Trump and watch what happens. It's that word has been associated with negative emotional content, and it's almost, that's entrainment right there. So what Jonathan can do, and they study this, is linkages, creating redefining words. So they were able to group alt-right with Trump, and then they can redefine a cartoon frog as being this evil character, and it's really the essence of manipulation. And the world that I think Jonathan Morgan lives in is a world, and he literally did have this as a title, that truth doesn't exist, or the death of truth, or something like that. And it's sort of a relativism philosophy. It's basically turns humans into abstract entities who don't have views. They are just tools, and they're just buckets that can be programmed using this thing that he's trying to sell. And it's very revealing. You learn more. I learned more about this person from just seeing how he sells his product and what is his view of the world, and you can look at it from that angle, and then everything else seems to fall into place.
Yeah, you just really, some of the words that you chose when you described him really amplified for me my whole impression of Sebenish sociopathy, in which they're purposely tailoring their language so that they can get the desired outcome. And many people in the Enneagram world think of the threes as the quintessential con man or salesman, but in many ways the 7 is actually much more that way, because what a 3 does is he'll connect with the person's emotions, and then he'll form a connection that's emotion based, and the 3 will then lead that emotional connection where he wants it to go. But a 7 isn't connecting emotionally. He is connecting his mental process to the person's emotions, which is almost by definition manipulation, because your connection isn't really genuine. Now that's my own way of looking at it.
Exactly. Let's look at the next clip, because it could be from the same piece. I think it is. It's just a little later on when he actually moves in to try to close the sale.
All right. What did Twitter purge? And are the complaints from some of the sort of some in the conservative sphere who say they got too aggressive?
I think that what's really happened here is the conservative community here are in fact victims, and not victims of Twitter's purge, but victims of the sort of
bots,
propagandists, the attackers, right? The people who wanted to spread disinformation and manipulate their online conversation. So I can, of course, from the perspective of people who have lost thousands of followers, you can see why they would be upset or assume that this was that Twitter, in fact, was targeting the conservative community online. But I think that's missing the point. All Twitter's doing is focused on accounts that are obviously automated, accounts that are obviously coordinating their activity, accounts that are obviously sort of spamming and manipulating their platform in the wake of tragedies like the shooting in Florida, and they're trying to remove that influence from the conversation, to Twitter's credit. And I think that the fact that they've become the bad guys in the kind of conservative punditry is a mistake, when in fact the real bad guys are the ones who perpetrated this in the first place, and were setting up these fake accounts and these troll networks in order to try and manipulate the way that they discuss the issues of the day. So I think it's kind of putting the blame in the wrong place.
That's just a bold-faced lie.
Well, again, he's underestimating the conservative side of the spectrum, and you can see that he really believes what he's saying, and it's just idiotic.
Well, yeah, I think I'm not sure he thinks in terms of logic so much as he thinks in terms of applying his view of information to the situation at hand. So for Jonathan, it's a given that the Russians are influencing the conservatives. That's what he believes, and he'll use confirmation bias to prove it. And he doesn't even give examples. That's the odd thing, is that he'll just say, I think he's using the whole idea of conservatives as victims as kind of a hook to see who's going to bite on that, to see if, well, maybe I can get some conservatives to switch sides if they can view themselves as victims, and oh my gosh, I'll agree with the Russian narrative because they fooled me. And then I'll flip. You can flip anything with this kind of pseudo logic. It's just it's not real. It's not based in facts or tangible reality. It's based on a scenario that's in your head that you apply in order to get the outcome that you want.
If he believes what he said, he's astonishingly ignorant, and I don't think he's ignorant. Therefore, I think he knows that that's a falsehood. How can that, what we've heard is that the algorithms and the intentional ridding of conservatives from social media has targeted those who have the biggest accounts, the most followers first, therefore rendering the whole movement less effective. Because let's face it, if somebody has many subscribers, their message is going to be spread further. So the purge has begun with the people who have the most followers. And if what he was saying was sincere, then it stands to reason that the smaller accounts would have been banned first, because they would be the ones who would be more likely to be victims.
Now,
great logic there from a feeler. I love that.
Yes, it's very good. In fact, I'll add on to that I don't even think he is talking about conservatives like we're sitting here watching him. He's the victim. The victims are on the left. Frankly, what he's doing is he's depersonalizing the enemy. So when the time does come when a conservative is whatever, shadow banned or censored, that the left has probably believed this narrative that, well, they're just being programmed anyway, so they don't count. It's a way of objectifying the enemy, depersonalizing their opinion. And in that regard, I tend to agree that he probably knows that he's pulling our leg. He may believe certain parts of it, but it's not the point. The victim, and I look at this guy, and I look at the opposite. Whatever he tells me the world is this way, I think, what's the other side of it? And it yields an interesting perspective. So my conclusion is that so far, from what I'm seeing, is that the liberals have been victims. They've been fed this Russian narrative for years and years through all these different outlets. It came from this point source right here. You're looking him right in the eye.
Yeah. And another name for this whole phenomenon is projection. But in other words, he's teaching people how to project. If they're not projecting already, he's the projection master. He's training the minds of the lefts to project. They are, and when I say projection, that's a psychological phenomenon, meaning that you see outside of yourself what's actually inside of yourself. So you're actually a victim, but you're being taught to see others as victims. And what does that do? That blinds you yourself to your own victimhood. And I'm not saying that leftists don't think of themselves as victims, because they certainly do. But in this particular arena of information and control and propaganda, they don't. They believe they have the truth, but if they can be taught to believe that their political enemies are victims of disinformation, they can, number one, feel superior. Number two, they will be almost completely unable to see it in their own selves.
Well, it's depersonalizing the enemy, and I think it's a linguistic construct. And just a minor example, General Dwight Eisenhower in his memoirs never uses the word Germans. He refers to the Germans as the German. Just this sort of linguistic catch-all, depersonalized. And this is coming from the military. This is military-grade communication, and it's being used on our civilian population, and it's just not quite right.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's look at that meme, though. I think we're getting close to wrapping up, and someday we'll deal with the actual clip behind it. It's fascinating, but this does give people a look at the so-called Russian memes, and we just want to break those down a little bit. It's fascinating. The artwork, the style, it doesn't look right to me. Most of us have seen lots of memes, and we don't just accept them as is, but I think the Jack Nicholson version is the more interesting. So it's in training the gullible to agree that they're a racist. Maybe that you end up on the poop list if you like that meme. But I don't know how much. I never saw either one of these, and they're ridiculous, really.
Yeah, I don't think it's particularly persuasive. The number one, I'm just so used to Jack Nicholson as not exactly being a supporter of Donald Trump. So I'm not too inclined to want to see him paint himself as a racist. Anyway, it just doesn't work for me.
Well, here's the thing. Now let's look at it from another lens. Is maybe this wasn't addressed to the right. Maybe this is really another form of entraining the left. And if you look at the Jesus icon on the other side, you've got the Prince of Peace, using violence against women. So this is when I know this may be fraud. This may have been produced in the U.S. It's got fingerprints on it that seem familiar, and it just seems like somebody who just was totally clueless about the culture of Christianity and wanted to push the right buttons on the left would choose this image. So it wasn't for the right. That's what I'm saying. What do you think of that hypothesis?
Yeah, I guess if you think that they're just trying to reinforce their own base, then it makes sense. Are you saying that they're actually trying to convince you that the right would like these memes and that these are supposedly right-wing memes? It's just, I can see the Jesus one that way, but it's obviously nothing that anybody that I know politically would find even interesting.
Well, let's look at it from a forensic angle. Okay, so we have to accept the fact that maybe somebody in Russia did create this. That's a possibility. But there's another possibility that needs to be entertained, and that this was not created in Russia. That this was a fraudulent piece of work. And if that's true, that means that having it being presented to the Senate IC would be a fraudulent act as well. And I would like to know, or I'd like to have definite proof of where this thing came from, because it just doesn't sit right. It doesn't look authentic. It's like when my kids were young, I could always tell when they were pulling my leg. They would use imagery that was not appropriate for the context in which they were trying to lead me. And this is where I'm going with it, is that especially, well, both of them really are just, they remind me of the thought form that I see on the left in continental U.S., not some troll farm in Russia. They're hitting some nerves that would not be in comportment with the theory that they were produced by someone who was a Russian.
I suspect that these were produced possibly in order to reinforce the left at how they are intelligent and people on the right are infantile and stupid.
Well, I also would have to look at this as that the reason this is here is because it's right there. It was designed so that this person, Renee DiResta, could make this presentation and make it work, make it plausible, make the evidence plausible. It wasn't crafted to be a meme. It was crafted to support.
Yeah, to support the idea that you're doing an investigation about memes. Yeah, I agree.
So she could stand up there and, it's sort of a backwards construction. So it is construction. We know what that is. Mueller parallel construction. So I'm sort of using an inductive construction, and it's starting with the ending. Possibly, I'm not saying that she did this. It's a very serious crime if it did happen, but I'm introducing the possibility that that's what might have happened here.
Well, yeah, to walk through that just a little bit step by step, it would be that she didn't create these herself. She said, "Oh, I'm going to do something about Russian memes. I have to present this. Hey, you source that I know that it's in the intelligence community. Can you grab some of those for me?" And we know that it's a part of the intelligence community that aligns with her political viewpoints, and they'll find something that fits with the narrative she's going to present. So there's that deniability. She's got
right, plausible.
She didn't create it. Yeah.
Well, it's compartmentalized. So I run a graphics business. So who would have actually done this work? Well, probably wasn't 60 years old, probably wasn't 50 years old. You're going to have to move down the age spectrum, probably in their 20s, and not at high level. They're compartmentalized, so they're in the graphics department. They're not a presenter like she is, or a field agent, or one of the analysts. They know how to use Photoshop, and they know about fonts. Look at the similarity in the fonts, in the kerning. There's something about this that's not right, and it was created by someone with the intent to deceive.
Yeah, and we can't get through this segment where we're talking about memes from the left, even if they're supposedly from Russia, without using the famous phrase, "the left can't meme." And there's a reason for that, is that that good memes come from a spark of creativity that originates in a human brain, linking things graphically and textually that hadn't been linked quite that way before, that sparks something within a large segment of the population, so that if it does what it's supposed to do, it goes viral.
Yes,
and
right.
Those
exactly.
are elements that come from a single or very small group of creative minds. It has traction because you're immediately drawn to the statement that it makes when it presents these two things together, this image and this text. That is not happening here.
This has got a subtext, and you're dead on. Memes are usually very direct, and they don't have a spin-off. Now, both of these are subtextual, and it's not characteristic of meme craft.
Exactly. Yeah. I think my main takeaway, just personally, from the information we presented today, has a lot to do with seeing how Jonathan Morgan works and getting to recognize the way that his brain is able to lead people in the direction that he wants them to go. It's a very cognitive thing, but it's not logic-based. And recognizing that and not being overcome with the speed of the connections he makes and the certainty of his assumptions, it actually leads you to question whether the logic he's presenting is in fact real logic or pseudo logic. And that's the main takeaway for me. Oftentimes, people that are thinkers may not be actually thinking in a logical sense. And of course, by that, we think that logic means thinking, and thinking means logic. Well, sometimes people with strong cognitive ability unlink them on purpose, and I think that's what I'm seeing with Jonathan Morgan.
Right. It's looking at life and politics as a game, an abstraction, and something devoid of intense meaning, that's sort of that self-evident meaning. And it runs counter to the other view, the other view that we do, that life does have meaning, and that we do go through changes in life that cause us to readapt our opinions. And I don't think that Jonathan wants us to be living in that world, and wants a different result, and does not want his enemies involved in the progress of defining that narrative.
My parting thought is that, again, in 2016, Obama made it legal for the U.S. government to propagandize its own people. And this is reminiscent for me of when J.P. Morgan, I think it was 1917, made a determination through study how many newspapers he would have to own in order to craft public opinion. And he went and purchased a little bit more than he found he needed. And there has been, since then, social controllers have become accustomed to being able to craft and direct the opinion of the American people. And it was reinforced in 2016 that not only corporations would do it, but that the government intentionally does that. So I'd like for everyone who's listening to certainly be aware of that, And to the curious, the seekers, and to the experts, thank you for joining us for this week's presentation of the Poli-Psych podcast. We typically produce one podcast per week and invite you to tune in and to subscribe so that you will never miss an episode. Until next week's episode, take care.